we're doing from page 45, I believe. Yes. So we were, blah, blah, blah. In situ, dozen intelligent men who never read a line of political economy. Okay. The parts of the farmer's crop held for sale or for seed, or to feed his help in part payment of wages, would be accounted capital. That held for use of his own family would not be. The horses and carriage of a hackman would be classed as capital, but an equipage kept for pleasure of its owner would not. So no one would think of counting as capital the false hair on the head of a woman, the cigar in the mouth of a smoker, or the toy with which a child is playing. But the stock of a hair dealer, a tobacconist, or the keeper of a toy store would be unhesitatingly set down as capital. A coat which a tailor has made for sale would be accounted capital, but not the coat he had made for himself. Food in the possession of a hotel keeper or a restaurateur would be accounted capital, but not the food in his pantry. But not the food in the pantry of a housewife or in the lunch basket of a working man. Pig iron in the hands of the smelter or founder or dealer would be accounted capital, but not the pig iron used as ballast in the hold of a yacht. The bellows of a blacksmith, the looms of a factory would be capital, but not the sewing machine of a woman who does only her own work. A building let for hire or used for business or productive purposes, but not a homestead. In short, I think we should find that now, as when Dr. Adam Smith wrote, that part of a man's stock which he expects to yield him a revenue is called his capital. And omitting his unfortunate slip as to personal qualities and qualifying somewhat his enumeration of money, it is doubtful if we could better list the different articles of capital than did Adam Smith in the passage which in the previous part of this chapter I have condensed. Now, if after having thus separated the wealth that is capital from the wealth that is not capital, we look for the distinction between the two classes, we shall not find it to be as to the character, capabilities, or final destination of the things themselves, as have been vainly attempted to draw it. But it seems to me that we shall find it to be as to whether they are or are not in the possession of the consumer. Such articles of wealth as in themselves, in their uses, or in their products, are yet to be exchanged, are capital. Such articles of wealth as are in the hands of the consumer are not capital. Hence, if we define capital as wealth in course of exchange, understanding exchange to include not merely passing from hand to hand, but also such transmutations as occur when the reproductive or transforming forces of nature are utilized for the increase of wealth, we shall, I think, comprehend all the things that the general idea of capital properly includes and shut out all it does not. Under this definition, it seems to me, for instance, will fall all such tools as are really capital. For it is as to whether its service or use are to be exchanged or not, which makes a tool an article of capital or merely an article of wealth. Thus, the lathe of a manufacturer used in making things which are to be exchanged for capital, while the lathe kept by a gentleman for his own amusement is not. Thus, wealth used in the construction of a railroad, a public telegraph line, a stagecoach, a theater, a hotel, etc., may be said to be placed in the course of exchange. The exchange is not effected all at once, but little by little, with an indefinite number of people. Yet there is an exchange, and the consumers of the railroad, the telegraph line, the stagecoach, theater, or hotel are not the owners, but the persons who from time to time use them. Nor is this definition inconsistent with the idea that capital is a part of wealth devoted to production. It is too narrow an understanding of production, which confines it merely to the making of things. Production includes not merely the making of things, but the bringing of them to the consumer. The merchant or storekeeper is thus as truly a producer as is the manufacturer or farmer, and his stock or capital is as much devoted to production as is theirs. But it is not worthwhile now to dwell upon the functions of capital, which we shall better able to determine hereafter, nor is the definition of capital I have suggested of any importance. I am not writing a textbook, but only attempting to discover the laws which control a great social problem, and if the reader has been led to form a clear idea of what things are meant when we speak of capital, my purpose is served. But before closing this digression, let me call attention to what is often forgotten, namely the terms wealth, capital, wages, and the like, as used in political economy, are abstract terms, and that nothing can be generally affirmed or denied of them that cannot be affirmed or denied of the whole class of things they represent. The failure to bear this in mind has led to much confusion of thought and permits fallacies, otherwise transparent, to pass for obvious truth. Wealth being an abstract term, the idea of wealth, it must be remembered, involves the idea of exchangeability. The possession of wealth to a certain amount is potentially the possession of any or all species of wealth to that equivalent in exchange, and consequently so of capital. Okay. This is chapter 3, which is page, I can't read that number, 49, I guess. Chapter 3, wages not drawn from capital, but produced by the labor. The importance of this digression will, I think, become more and more apparent as we proceed in our inquiry, but its pertinency to the branch we are now engaged in may at once be seen. It is at first glance evident that the economic meaning of the term wages is lost sight of, and attention is concentrated upon the common and narrow meaning of the word when it is affirmed that wages are drawn from capital. For in all those cases in which the laborer is his own employer and takes directly the produce of his labor as its reward, it is plain enough that wages are not drawn from capital, but result directly as the product of the labor. If, for instance, I devote my labor to gathering birds' eggs or picking wild strawberries, the eggs or strawberries the eggs or berries I thus get are my wages. Surely no one contend that in such case wages are drawn from capital. There is no capital in the case. An absolutely naked man, thrown on an island where no human being has before trod, may gather birds' eggs or pick berries. Or if I take a piece of leather and work it up into a pair of shoes, the shoes are my wages, the reward of my exertion. Surely they are not drawn from capital, either my capital or anyone else's capital, but are brought into existence by the labor of which they become the wages, and in obtaining this pair of shoes as the wages of my labor, capital is not even momentarily lessened one iota. For if we call in the idea of capital, my capital at the beginning consists of the piece of leather, the thread, etc. As my labor goes on, value is steadily added until, when my labor results in the finished shoes, I have my capital plus the difference in value between the material and the shoes. In obtaining this additional value, my wages, how is capital at any time drawn upon? Adam Smith, who gave the direction to economic thought that has resulted in the current elaborate theories of the relation between wages and capital, recognized the fact that in such simple cases as I have instanced, wages are the product of labor, and thus begins his chapter upon the wages of labor. Quote, the produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor. In that original state of things which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him. Had the great Scotsman taken this as the initial point of his reasoning and continued to regard the produce of labor as the natural wages of labor, and the landlord and master but as sharers, his conclusions would have been very different, and political economy today would not embrace such a mass of contradictions and absurdities. But instead of following the truth obvious in the simple modes of production as a clue through the perplexities of the more complicated forms, he momentarily recognizes it, only to immediately abandon it, and stating that, quote, in every part of Europe 20 workmen serve under a master for one that is independent, end quote. He recommences the inquiry from a point of view in which the master is considered as providing from his capital the wages of his workmen. It is evident that in thus placing the proportion of self-employing workmen as but 1 in 20, Adam Smith had in mind but the mechanic arts, and that including all laborers, the proportion of who take their earnings directly without the intervention of an employer must, even in Europe 100 years ago, have been much greater than this. For besides the independent laborers who in every community exist in considerable numbers, the agriculture of large districts of Europe has since the time of the Roman Empire been carried on by the métayer system, under which the capitalist receives his return from the labor instead of the laborer from the capitalist. At any rate, in the United States, where any general law of wages must apply as fully as in Europe, and where, in spite of the advances of manufacturers, a very large part of the people are yet self-employing farmers, the proportion of laborers who get their wages through an employer must be comparatively small. But it is not necessary to discuss the ratio in which self-employing laborers anywhere stand to hired laborers, nor is it necessary to multiply illustrations of the truism that where the laborer takes directly his wages, they are the product of his labor. For as soon as it is realized that the term wages includes all the earnings of labor, as well as when taken directly by the laborer in the results of his labor as when received from an employer, it is evident that the assumption that wages are drawn from capital, on which a universal truth such a vast superstructure is standard political economic treatise so unhesitatingly built, is at least in large part untrue, and that the utmost that can with any plausibility be affirmed is that some wages, i.e. wages received by the laborer from the employer, are drawn from capital. This restriction of the major premise at once invalidates all the deductions that are made from it, but without resting here, let us see whether even in this restricted sense it accords with the facts. Let us pick up the clue where Adam Smith dropped it, and advancing step by step, see whether the relation of facts, which is obvious in the simplest forms of production, does not run through the most complex. Next, in simplicity to, quote, that original state of things, end quote, of which many examples may yet be found, where the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer, is the arrangement in which the laborer, through working for another person or with the capital of another person, receives his wages in kind, that is to say, in the things his labor produces. In this case, it is clear, as in the case of the self-employing laborer, that the wages are really drawn from the product of the labor and not at all from capital. If I hire a man to gather eggs, to pick berries, or to make shoes, paying him from the eggs, the berries, or the shoes that his labor secures, there can be no question that the source of the wages is the labor for which they are paid. Of this form of hiring is the seer and dayer stock tendency, treated of with such perspicuity by Sir Henry Maine in Early History of Institutions, and which so clearly involved the relation of employer and employed as to render the acceptor of cattle the man or vassal of the capitalist who thus employed him. It was on such terms as these that Jacob worked for Laban, and to this day, even in civilized country, it is not an infrequent mode of employing labor. The farming of land on shares, which prevails to a considerable extent in the southern states of the Union and in California, the métayer system of Europe, as well as the many cases in which superintendents, salesmen, etc., are paid a percentage of profits. What are they but the employment of labor for wages which consist in part of its produce? The next step in the advance from simplicity to complexity is where the wages, though estimated in kind, are paid in an equivalent of something else. For instance, on American whaling ships, the custom is not to pay fixed wages, but a lay, or a proportion of the catch, which varies from a 16th to a 12th to the captain, down to a 300th to the cabin boy. Thus, when a whale ship comes into New Bedford or San Francisco after a successful cruise, she carries in her hold the wages of her crew, as well as the profits of her owners, and an equivalent which will reimburse them for all stores used up during the voyage. Can anything be clearer than that these wages, this oil and bone which the crew of the whaler have taken, have not been drawn from capital, but really a part of the produce of their labor? Nor is this fact changed or obscured in the slightest degree where, as a matter of convenience, instead of dividing up between the crew their proportion of the oil and bone, the value of each man's share is estimated at the market price, and he is paid for it in money. The money is but the equivalent of the real wages, the oil and the bone. In no way is there any advantage of capital in this payment. The obligation to pay wages does not accrue until the value from which they are to be paid is brought into port. At the moment when the owner takes from his capital money to pay the crew, he adds to his capital oil and bone. So far there can be no dispute. Let us now take another step which will bring us to the unusual method of employing labor and paying wages. The Farallone Islands off the Bay of San Francisco are a hatching ground of seafowl, and a company who claim these islands employ men in the proper season to collect eggs. They might employ these men for a proportion of the eggs they gather, as is done in the whale fishery, and possibly would do so if there were much uncertainty attending the business. But as the fowl are plentiful and tame, and about so many eggs can be gathered by so much labor, they find it more convenient to pay their men fixed wages. The men go out and remain on the islands, gathering the eggs and bringing them to a landing, whence, at intervals of a few days, they are taken in a small vessel to San Francisco and sold. When the season is over, the men return and are paid their stipulated wages in coin. Does not this transaction amount to the same thing as if, instead of being paid in coin, the stipulated wages were paid in an equivalent of the eggs gathered? Does not coin represent the eggs, by the sale of which it was obtained, and are not these wages as much the product of the labor for which they are paid, as the eggs would be in the possession of a man who gathered them for himself without the intervention of an employer? To take another example which shows by reversion the identity of wages and money with wages in kind. In San Benaventura lives a man who makes an excellent living by shooting for their oil and skins the common hair seals which frequent the islands forming the Santa Barbara Channel. When on these sealing expeditions, he takes 2 or 3 Chinamen along to help him, whom at first he paid wholly in coin. But it seems that the Chinese highly value some of the organs of the seal, which they dry and pulverize for medicine, as well as the long hairs in the whiskers of the male seal, which, when over a certain length, they gather steam for some purpose that to outside barbarians is not very clear. And this man soon found that the Chinamen were very willing to take instead of money the parts of the seals killed, so that now, in large part, he thus pays them their wages. Now, it is not what may be seen in all these cases, the identity of wages in money with wages in kind, true of all cases in which wages are paid for productive labor? Is not the fund created by the labor really the fund from which the laborers are paid? It may perhaps be said, quote, there is a difference where a man works for himself, or where, when working for an employer, he takes his wages in kind. His wages depend upon the result of his labor. Should that, from any misadventure, prove futile, he gets nothing. When he works for an employer, however, he gets his wages anyhow. They depend upon the performance of the labor, not upon the result of the labor. But this is evidently not a real distinction, for on average the labor that is rendered for fixed wages not only yields the amount of the wages, but more, else employers could make no profit. When wages are fixed, the employer takes the whole risk and is compensated for this assurance, for wages when fixed are always somewhat less than wages contingent. But though when fixed wages are stipulated, the laborer who has performed his part of the contract has usually a legal claim upon the employer, it is frequently, if not generally, the case that the disaster which prevents the employer from reaping benefit from the labor prevents him from paying the wages. And in one important department of industry, the employer is legally exempt in case of disaster, although the contract be for wages certain and not contingent. For the maximum of admiralty law is that freight is the mother of wages, and though the seaman may have performed his part, the disaster which prevents the ship from earning freight deprives him of his claim for his wages. In this legal maxim is embodied the truth for which I am contending. Production is always the mother of wages. Without production, wages would not and could not be. It is from the produce of labor, not from the advances of capital, that wages come. Whenever we analyze the facts, this will be founded to be true. For labor always precedes wages. This is as universally true of wages received by the laborer from an employer as it is of wages taken directly by the laborer from his own employment. In the one class of cases, as in the other, reward is conditioned upon exertion, paid sometimes by the day, oftener by the week or month, occasionally by the year, and in many branches of our production by the piece. The payment of wages by an employer to an employee always implies the previous rendering of labor by the employee for the benefit of the employer. For the few cases in which advance payments are made for personal services are evidently referable either to charity or to guarantee and purchase. The name retainer given to advance payments to lawyers shows the true character of the transaction, as does the name blood money given in longshore vernacular to a payment which is nominally wages advanced to sailors, out which in reality is purchase money. Both English and American law considering a sailor as much a chattel as a pig. I dwell on this obvious fact that labor always precedes wages because it is all important to an understanding of the more complicated phenomena of wages that it should be kept in mind. And obvious as it is, as I have put it, the plausibility of the proposition that wages are drawn from capital, a proposition that is made the basis for such important and far-reaching deductions, comes in the first instance from a statement that ignores and leads the intention away from this truth. That statement is that labor cannot exert its productive power unless supplied by capital with maintenance. The unwary reader at once recognizes the fact that the laborer must have food, clothing, etc. in order to enable him to perform the work, and having been told that the food, clothing, etc. used by productive laborers are capital, he assents to the conclusion that the consumption of capital is necessary to the conclusion that the consumption of capital is necessary to the application of labor, and from this it is but an obvious deduction that industry is limited by capital, that the demand for labor depends upon the supply of capital, and hence that wages depend upon the ratio between the number of laborers looking for employment and the amount of capital devoted to hiring them. But I think the discussion in the previous chapter will enable anyone to see wherein lies the fallacy of this reasoning, a fallacy which has entangled some of the most acute minds in a web of their own spinning. It is in the use of the term capital in two senses. In the primary proposition that capital is unnecessary to the exertion of productive labor, the term capital is understood as including all food, clothing, shelter, etc., whereas in the deduction finally drawn from it, the term was used in its common and legitimate meaning of wealth devoted, not in the immediate gratification of desire, but to the procurement of more wealth, of wealth in the hands of employers as distinguished from laborers. The conclusion is no more valid than it would be from the acceptance of the proposition that A laborer cannot go to work without his breakfast and some clothes. To infer that no more laborers can go to work than employment first furnish with breakfast and clothes. Now the fact is that the laborers generally furnish their own breakfast and the clothes in which they go to work. The further fact is that capital, in the sense in which the word is used to distinction to labor, in exceptional cases sometimes may, but is never compelled to make advances to labor before the work begins. Of all the vast number of unemployed laborers in the civilized world today, there is probably not a single one willing to work who could not be employed without any advance of wages. A great proportion would doubtless gladly go to work on terms which did not require the payment of wages before the end of the month. It is doubtful if there are enough to be called a class who would not go to work and wait for their wages until the end of the week, as most laborers habitually do, while there are certainly none who would not wait for their wages until the end of the day, or, if you please, until their next meal hour. The precise time of the payment of wages is immaterial. The essential point, the point I lay stress on, is that it is after the performance of work. So this is on page 58. I'm stopping now.